Hello and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Jason Knight, and on each episode of this podcast, I'll be having inspiring conversations with passionate product people. If you want to dip your toe in the water, why don't you head over to onenightinproduct.com after this, check out some of my other episodes, sign up to the mailing list, or subscribe on your favourite podcast app. Tell all your friends to get their swimsuits on too. On tonight's episode, we'll be talking about setting yourself up for success by setting a long-term product strategy to help you 10x your users' outcomes. We'll talk about some of the problems with bedding in true customer centricity and making sure you're not just concentrating on who you're selling to now, but who you'll be selling to in the future. We'll also talk about what it's like taking over your boss's product consultancy, scraping his name off the door, and then going on to write a book with him anyway. For all this and much more, please join us on One Night in Product. So my guest tonight is Rajesh Nerlikar. Rajesh is a product advisor, coach, recruiter and author who's passionate about using the power of tech to change lives. Rajesh describes himself as a Texas boomerang, having failed to resist the lure of chimichangas and headed back home to Austin after a career that took him on a grand tour around North America. Rajesh is the co-author of Build What Matters, a book that promises to teach you to deliver key outcomes with vision-led product management. Hi Rajesh, how are you tonight?
Doing great, thanks for having me.
No problem, it's a pleasure to have you here. So first things first, you are the CEO of Podify. So for the record, who are Podify and what problem do they solve?
Yeah, so Prodify, we are a product advisory firm, and the key problems we're solving is working with startup executives and founders and product team leads to become a more product-driven organization, and do that by focusing on what their customers care about and building kind of what matters. And that's sort of what led into the book. There's sort of like two big buckets of things that we help companies with. So product vision and strategy. Where are you going? How are you going to get there? Why is your product going to win out in the market? How do you bring the entire team along on that journey and create and communicate a very clear vision and strategy to realize it? The second thing that we do is product team development. So as you mentioned, we do a lot of recruiting. So we have a hiring service, and then we also do a lot of coaching, everything from product executives to individual product managers and entire product teams at some of our larger clients.
And what types of company are you working for mainly? I mean, is it a real mix, or does it tend very heavily towards, say, startups or scale-ups? I mean, you've mentioned larger clients as well. So is it literally across the board, or?
It is mostly across the board, probably a slight lean towards startups and also scale-ups or growth stage companies, yeah.
Yeah, because one of the things that I was thinking as you were describing that was that, and it's a common theme on this podcast, last few episodes with various people talking about similar issues, is like there's a bunch of companies, maybe the larger, maybe more legacy companies, that are doing product, quote unquote, badly, whether or not they're actually doing it badly or managing to succeed by mistake or whatever, but they're not doing things the way that presumably your book would advise or any of the other books would advise. And they're kind of stuck in a legacy mindset and find it really hard to transition into a proper product-led organization. Do you work with those types of companies too, or are you working with people that have kind of got it already and are just trying to get there better, or do you have to try and transform people as well?
I'd say there's a little bit of a mix. What I'd say is our clients probably would lean to saying, I understand the value of being a product-driven organization, and I would love some help trying to make this transition, because sometimes, the behavior is built into the DNA of the organization. And it's been like that for so long, and making this transition isn't easy. What I will say is, like, I don't really ever think of it as like, this company is not doing product right. What I've realized is, kind of having done this for so long, is product has taken so many shapes and flavors at different organizations, because it is probably one of the newest functions that's been introduced, especially even in the tech community, right? Or at tech companies. And what that means is that the sort of like genesis of the product team may have taken many different flavors, and sometimes it might have been more delivery oriented. It was around like kind of, hey, you sit between the business and technology and make sure things ship on time, and therefore it's kind of, that's sort of like what's been happening. And at other organizations, there may have been a realization, or like they might have had a different value prop for what product's role was, and it might have been more around, you represent the voice of the customer, and therefore, it's a key role, and we want to make sure that we're always building the things that matter to our customers. And then there's a spectrum in between. So, I think that there's kind of that aspect. And honestly, what I don't know if it's surprising for me, but We do work with a lot of startups, and some of them just, there's so many new founders who are first time entrepreneurs, and
Hmm.
not all of them have come from a product background, or they may not have worked at a company where they saw what sort of a product driven approach could look like.
Yeah.
And so they also have sort of some biases on what product, the role of product is. And so, I think there's just kind of a wide spectrum, and like, to each his own, right? Every company has gotten to where they are doing what worked for them, and there's no right or wrong way to build a company. Obviously, as product folks, we talk about the scalability of being product driven and how you can kind of accelerate the growth by having sort of the product mindset. But there's a lot of ways to build that company.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, that point around founders that have come from non-traditional product backgrounds, that they come inheriting all the biases of their previous organization. I remember doing a talk a little while back where I described the fact that, for example, that if your startup supports or serves enterprise clients, for example, that quite often you'll find someone who used to work for that type of enterprise client who has a fantastic idea, and then they start a startup to serve that idea, but they've come from that world and they have absolutely no idea how to actually make that startup scale, to your point. So hopefully your book and others will help with that.
I think there's an important point, which is I often talk about the scale. How scalable does your product need to be to hit the business objectives you have, right? There are a lot of companies who set up shop explicitly to go sell to the Fortune 1000. And the reality is they're not Netflix. They don't need a single product that serves millions of customers. They need like a product that can work mostly for like 20 or 30 companies. And that's an amazing business you can build on top of it. And so I think having some sense of like how critical is scalability to our business model or our goals is an important part of the sort of like decision on the role of product as well.
No, absolutely. But Podify didn't start out as Podify.
That's right.
Yeah, I've done my research. It started out as Foster Innovation with Ben Foster, your co-author of the book. And then you helped reboot it, I think, in around 2019 and rebranded it, rebuilt it as Prodify. Was that like a full-on pivot and total reinvention of what you were doing, or was it more of a branding exercise, or somewhere in between? Like, what drove that change?
Yeah, for sure. It wasn't a pivot. It was not necessarily a branding exercise. Honestly, it was about scalability for us. And so the story here was, my background has been in product, mostly at startups. Ben and I worked together at a company in Washington, D.C. called O-Power, related to the residential energy efficiency. He was the head of product, and that was my actually first product job. And O-Power went public about 7 years ago now, and Ben left the company after the IPO and started doing some advisory and coaching work. And rightfully so, had a very creative name for his firm, which was one person, and it was called Foster Innovation. And so he started that about 7 years ago. And then I reached out a few years ago, actually coming up on maybe 3.5. And so I was interested in doing some similar type of work. Happened to be good timing. He ended up joining one of his clients as chief product officer, a company called Go Canvas out of the DC area. So I took over the practice then. And, to your point, for a year or so, it was still called Foster Innovation. And we started realizing there's actually a lot of interest in what we do, but it might be weird if we continue to be called Foster Innovation and everyone was like, where's Ben Foster? And so that was sort of what drove the rebranding to Prodify. And now there's 2.5 of us working full time and a few part-time folks.
Makes sense. But before that, you had a long career, and you touched on it yourself, working in a bunch of different places, working for different product, working in product for a bunch of different companies. I actually lost count of the number of times I had to click more on your LinkedIn to keep going down and down the list. It seems that you've had a real range of experience, which is obviously really helpful for the role that you're doing now. One thing that did stick out was a jump from consumer insights intern at General Mills to VP of product at hitchters.com. So obviously that's jumping quite a few spaces on the snakes and ladders board at once. But I understand that was a startup. So was that your startup?
So that was a student-run company, and when I went to business school up at Michigan to kind of get out of the world of technology consulting when I was at Accenture before that, and I wanted to transition explicitly into the world of startups, but I was also very interested in doing something that was way more consumer-facing. Like basically what I learned after 5 years in working in Accenture's government practice was I was mostly drawn to what we were building and how the citizens were going to use it. And so, I went from an engineer to a business analyst, and I just found myself constantly wanting to learn more about the end user and the consumers. And so I went to business school kind of with that explicit goal of getting into something consumer facing, and then also building, getting into the world of startups. And so Hitchters was this online ride sharing service well before Uber and Lyft. The general idea was we made it easy to share a black car from the airport to wherever you were going in some of the most expensive cities like New York and San Francisco. And so we matched people up when they landed at the airport, and then we told them where to go, and then they would have like a limousine waiting for them or a nice town car. And so, Jason, you're one of the first people to ever do this much research and ask me about it, but it actually was kind of a pivotal thing. And I'll say the time at General Mills was kind of foundational for me in the sort of customer centricity world. So I took the internship at General Mills and worked in consumer insights. I spent the summer thinking about how to make Old El Paso refried beans and Betty Crocker box potatoes better and supporting the brand managers in their quest to grow the businesses. So I literally sat behind one-way mirrors and listened to focus groups. I went to a grocery store and intercepted people in the aisle and asked them why they picked the box potato product they bought. And that's where I learned how to talk to, how to do customer discovery interviews and how to talk to consumers and extract consumer insights, both quantitative and qualitative. I ended up turning the offer down because I missed working in tech so much. And so when I came back second year, I was like, I think I have to stay in tech. I don't know if transitioning all the way into, the consumer packaged good industry is going to cut it for me. And so I came back and worked as VP of product at Hitchers. And I also started another company with a classmate of mine up at Michigan Ross. And it was in the sustainability space, which is kind of how I ended up at Opower eventually.
So I think you said before this that you've had something like 3 startups that you founded and all exited. I don't know if it was exactly 3 or if it was just 3 that you exited or if my numbers are wrong entirely. But I was going to say you probably qualify as a serial entrepreneur by any measure. What got you into building those companies and getting so passionate about building your own startups? Was it something that you always had the bug for, or was it something that you kind of learned as you were working your way through your career?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Every once in a while, I'll stop and think about where this sort of entrepreneurial like mindset came from. I think part of it is sort of growing up. So my he has 3 brothers, and all 3 of them started their own companies in India. So whenever we went to go visit, I would go into their like shops and see what they were doing and just kind of see that they were running their own businesses, and each one of them looked pretty cool. And then my dad himself, here in the US, ended up leaving his job and started his own company right before I went to college. And so I think that just being able to see that was probably what drove a lot of it. But I think that was combined with just this maybe curiosity and constant like wondering whether there could be a better way of doing things. And so I think those 2 things combined is what got me interested in sort of the world of entrepreneurship and startups. And yeah, I've worked at 6 and 3 have exited. So kind of like half. And the ones that didn't were some of the early ones that I started in my career. And so, definitely learned some lessons, which I talk about in the book.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, whether you'd had any startups that hadn't worked out, and it sounds like you've had at least 3. I mean, obviously, you say it's in the book, so we can't go through everything, but like, what's one key lesson that you've learned? Maybe something that was common across those 3 things, or like one overriding theme where you sit there and say, this is what I didn't do that I did do when I did the 3 successful exits, for example.
Yeah, I think a lack of talking to customers was by far the biggest one. And that's the one we talk about in the book. I tell a story about how I built a dating app, and it was something that I had wanted like 1 or 2 years earlier, just personally. And I never went and validated that other people might be interested in the idea, and also didn't do any research on sort of like what it actually takes to build a dating app. So I think that's kind of at the top. And this is one of we call them the 10 dysfunctions in chapter 1 of the book. And we kind of open that as the way of setting the stage of the problem that our book was intended to solve. And these are things that we had observed both from our own times as product people in operator roles, as well as having worked with about 75 companies now over the past 7 years and just done some pattern matching and what was the things that was holding our clients' product teams back the most,
Yeah, that's interesting, because if we go back to that idea about the people that have maybe come from a type of company and started to try and found a company on their own to serve the type of company that they used to work for, you sometimes get that bias there as well, right? It's like you're sitting there saying, oh, well, I used to work for such and such a type of company, and this is what I would want. And then you extrapolate that to the nth degree and end up with something that literally just that company would have wanted. So it sounds like, in a way, that was the same story-ish with you saying the dating app, like, this is what I would have wanted, but no one else did.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's a major fallacy is thinking that you were the customer and the only customer, and then just assuming that your requirements or needs or preferences are that they represent the entire market, right? And I think this is the fallacy that leads to non-product driven organizations, right? Where you take the one-off customer request and just say, oh, well, this next customer wanted something slightly different. That's fine. I'm sure there, other customers will say the same thing and not going to do the validation work and be like, well, let me go talk to 3 or 4 other customers and see how they would want to solve this problem so that we have a scalable solution down the road.
But then after you exited, presumably your third startup, you gave up on startups for a bit and you seem to go around a few different roles, either as an advisor, obviously you've done the recruitment stuff, you've worked as product leads in certain organizations as well. So what was it that stopped you making startups and got you into more of a kind of, I want to say, going more of a product management focus specifically? Like, what was it that drove that?
Yeah, sure. So I've kind of always stayed in the product management space. But what happened was after I worked at Opower, I went to another startup in the DC area as a senior PM, and it was a fintech. We had a financial wellness product, and our company was called Hello Wallet. So I was there for about a year before we got acquired by one of our investors, which was Morningstar up in Chicago. And so, ran the product team for about a year after the acquisition, and then moved up to Chicago to join Morningstar and take over an additional product suite to build out kind of a full portfolio of employee benefits. And I spent 2 years at Morningstar and had a great experience, really enjoyed the people I was working with. But honestly, I kind of missed the world of startups soon after I got there and started seeing kind of how a slightly larger organization would operate. So I started doing some advisory work at 1871 on the side up in Chicago, and I really enjoyed it. And so, that was kind of how I got my startup fix. And then, like I said, few years ago, we moved to Austin and I left Morningstar and I reached out to Ben Foster and I said, hey, I know you've been doing this type of work, mostly with startups for quite some time now. Could you tell me more about how you got started? And like I said, just happened to be a good timing. So I ended up taking over the practice.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I'm also curious about your recruitment activities as well. So obviously you say that you offer those services now, your day job, but you've also had that as your specific day job from time to time. You've actually been a product recruiter. And by product recruiter, I mean, obviously all heads of product get involved in product recruitment, but I'm assuming by product recruiter, you're talking about actually sourcing and matching candidates. Now, that's not something everyone enjoys, like the whole process of finding people and screening people and matching people. Was that something that you found really interesting, or was it just something that you got into because it was needed and then sort of built some expertise in it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I've always found it interesting in terms of like just thinking about the people side of a business and the product. And like, I just believe so much that, it's people that build products and the org structure and communication structures and culture and environment that they're, under the goals that they're being given influence so much of the end user experience that it matters a lot when you think about building the right team and putting the right person in the right role at the right time and those types of things. And so there was there was an interest, and then there was also a market sort of like request and demand for this, right? So we worked with a lot of companies. Many of them did not have product people. We started working with the CEO or the founder or a CTO, and they eventually realized like, wow, I think I need a product manager as a full-time hire. Is that something you can help with? And, we realized that they have never hired product people. And there's something a little bit unique about hiring product managers, right? We don't have the extra kind of objective data set that, an engineer might have when they complete a coding review, or a designer might have when you look at the design portfolio, right? There's kind of not really a tangible artifact you can look at that product managers have to sort of objectively recruit. And there's also a slightly different mindset you need with product managers. And so it's hard to pressure test and recruit for that. And so this is a service that's kind of gained steam, honestly, in the last probably 2 years with our clients. And so that's kind of how, I've stepped into that product recruiter role once in a while.
Excellent. I'm sure you see some interesting CVs as well.
Interesting to say the least. In fact, it was, I probably looked at 2,000 over the last 18 months, and they were so bad that we ended up creating a template for product managers because we were just like, I sometimes just couldn't even follow them, sort of the trajectory and outcomes and stuff.
Fair enough. Well, that'd be some useful homework for anyone listening to this that's looking for a job.
That's right.
So you wrote a book with Ben Foster, your erstwhile boss from back in the day, Build What Matters. Now that came out in, I think, September 2020. So it's been around for a few months now, but still fairly early in its life cycle. How's the reception been so far? Have you had lots of good feedback and reviews and people coming up to you and thanking you for it? Has it been pretty solid?
Yeah, it's been great and it's been amazing. I think we're at like 4.5 stars on Amazon. So like, quantitatively things are looking really good. Honestly, Ben and I spent a lot of time obviously writing the book last year, and the most rewarding thing is that random strangers will reach out on LinkedIn or Twitter and say, "Hey, I just got through with your book. It was so helpful." And like as an author, there's nothing more meaningful to know that something you put out there as sort of best practices and lessons learned has actually helped other folks. And that was what prompted us to write the book after we created the vision led framework a couple of years ago that was intended to capture all of the best practices we had learned from working with different product teams and being product managers ourselves.
But not everyone's good at writing books, right? So was that something that came naturally to the both of you? And did you manage to sort of divvy it up effectively and really work that through? Or was it a real struggle from time to time?
It was stressful, sometimes time consuming. Overall, I really liked it. And I'd say the thing that was probably more complicated was the fact that we co-wrote the book,
Yeah.
which meant that we had to be largely aligned on some of the key messages and the phrasing and all those things. Now, the good news is Ben and I see like 90%, we have like 90% overlap on our product philosophies. And it wouldn't be surprising, obviously, because I actually, built a lot of my early product chops while I was on his team. And so kind of absorbed a lot by osmosis. So overall, I had a really good time doing it. It did take a lot. There were a lot of weekends where I was just kind of holed up in my office on the iPad, like writing, doing a bunch of editing and then getting back to the computer and sending versions back and forth between me and Ben and our publisher. But it was good. But honestly, I enjoyed it so much that like this year, I just felt like a little bit of a gap in my life. I was like, oh, I haven't been writing as much. And so I've started to do a little bit more on like Twitter threads. I try to do a blog post, each month and just kind of continue to build on the sort of concepts of the framework.
Was there anything particularly controversial that you had to have an arm wrestle over at any point? Or did you manage to come to a gentleman's agreement over anything that you did disagree on?
No, honestly, I can't think of anything off the top of my head where I was like, well, I guess we'll just agree to disagree and write some really awkward chapter here where no one's going to know what we meant. No, like I said, I think we were like 90% aligned. And, I think the place where Ben and I probably differed is sort of like how data driven to be versus how much to trust your gut instinct. And, I think the reality is, I think we both agreed that you just need a balancing act. And the hardest part of being a good product manager is knowing when to trust your gut versus when to trust the data.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just on a high level helicopter view, what is the core value proposition of the book? I mean, you've touched on it slightly, but in your own words, why should people read this book?
You should read this book if you think it's important to have a clear product vision and a strategy to realize it. So if you feel like there's a lot of swirl or churn and nobody knows where the product is going, you're constantly in firefighting mode, you're being reactive to the customer requests and tech debt and all those things. That's what the framework was intended to sort of solve, is this world where, and like, we talked about it. Actually, I don't remember if we talked about this explicitly in the book. Where we landed was it felt like the pendulum swung a little bit too far on the agile transition, and that there was sort of this assumption like, if you want to build good products, you just do everything that your customers ask you to do. But then the question becomes, okay, one, that means you'll probably only be building the things that your customers today want you to do. But then like, how do you grow a business? What if you need to go to like the next market segment, and how do you like go build the things that these people don't even know, aren't even using your product, and you're not getting any feedback from them on? And so I think this was our attempt to sort of like bring things back to the middle and say 100%, you need to have some iterative changes to your product. And those largely come from like either observing the data, quantitative or qualitative, or a combination of the both. But you have to balance that with other needs that come with modern SaaS platforms. And that's sort of what led us to create this like roadmap balancing framework, where we talk about like the three categories of innovation, which is like progress towards the vision; iteration, which is like fixing things in the current product, whether it's usability issues or optimizing conversion funnels; and then operation, which is just the cost of having modern SaaS platforms, right? Performance, security, uptime, tech debt, bugs, internal tools, all those things. And so, obviously when we created a framework that says you should have a multi-year vision of where your product is going to end up in a few years, we had to complement that with the reality of like very few teams could dedicate 100% of their product development capacity to just like working on that vision, right? And so that was why we came up with the categories and said, do a top-down allocation first before you go prioritize a single thing. talk about what percentage of capacity should go towards these three categories of different product development, and then you could, by doing so, you can also start comparing apples to apples, because like, how do you stack rank a new feature against a bug, against a usability issue? It's like impossible to know which one to really focus on when you try to compare them to each other.
Yeah, there's this whole concept which has come up before of treating your time allocation as if it's like a portfolio, right? So, yeah, I mean, I've worked B2B and I've worked in more sales-led organizations, and it's possible to find a way in those organizations, absolutely, but it's always a fight, right? Because you've always got that next thing, and there's been loads of really good articles written about some of the struggles of being a fully sales-led development organization. So I think, yeah, the thing that I've seen probably offer the most hope is that allocation, like you're talking about, and just say, look, okay, we're just going to take this on the chin. We know this is going to happen, but we're going to try to control it. And as long as you get that exec buy-in to say, okay, well, yeah, fine, you can have your 15% and we'll stand behind you when you push back, then hopefully it's when you don't get that buy-in, right? That's when it starts to fall apart.
Yeah.
Everything's an and, not an or. And that's where it becomes a problem.
Yeah, 100%. Why can't you do more? And we talk about this in the book, but the genesis behind this was actually a system that Ben developed with the executive team at OPower. We called it the sales token system. And the short story was, the head of sales and the CEO, got into a room one day, and he was like, I can't just keep building everything sales is asking for. We'll never get to the actual roadmap that we as a product team believe is what our customers need. And so they said, okay, what if we did an exercise? What if we all wrote down or thought about what percentage of our capacity should go towards sales, things that the sales team believes are the things that we should be building? And they kind of naturally agreed on, I think it was an 85-15 split. And so then we were like, okay, cool. And then they ended up operationalizing that sort of model by saying the sales had this finite number of tokens that they could use to get whatever they want built on the roadmap. And it was 15% of overall capacity. And we tracked it with the operations team to make sure that it never went to 50% or anything. So
yeah, I can imagine there are some conversations from time to time, but again, as long as you can have that as an aspiration and try and enforce it, I guess that could work pretty well. But the framework, the vision-led product management framework, which this book, I assume, is kind of the encapsulation of, but also is something that you've worked on outside of this, and you've worked on it and developed it over the last few years. Now, there are a lot of frameworks out there. It seems that there's more coming out all the time, and there's always the next book which tells you how to do things and new different approaches and stuff like that. Would you say your framework is like an overarching thing that can just replace everything, or is it something that goes alongside and complements other frameworks that you might use around some other parts of your product that it doesn't cover?
Yeah, so it's definitely not some overarching end-all be-all. And I think, I did a bunch of customer discovery as we thought about launching another framework. And the reality of how most product teams use frameworks is that they pick and choose the parts of different frameworks that work well for their organization. And that's great. The reality, what that means is every organization has kind of a Frankenstein framework where they've kind of over time built it up. And the reality is, even within the framework that we talk about, we use other frameworks. For example, we like the Kano model for competitive differentiation and informing where how your product's going to be different in the market. So, I would say that we had not seen a framework that was so specific about how do you go and create a compelling product vision and use it to and I think if I were going to back up and talk about why that's even important, I think it comes down to the fact that if you want to be a strong product leader, you have to have some way to communicate where you think the product should go, and therefore, and then get everyone rallied around that, and then get into the execution mode, right? But without that, you probably will still remain in some kind of reactive mode. And there probably is a time and a place for that reactive mode. For example, when you first launch a new product, you're probably just listening to all the things that who's using it, who's not, what are they saying about it, all those things. And that might be totally fine. I mean, you not need the vision at that point. But at some point, you may find that product market fit, and you're like, actually, there's 3 legitimate paths we could follow, and we need to pick one, and we need to rationalize why we're going to go down one over another. And I think that's where the framework perhaps comes into play, and sort of really says, this is a concrete and it's a customer-centric vision. It explains what do we want our customer experience to look like in the future. It's not a bulleted list of features of all the things we need to build. And it's not some generic statement we're going to be a market leader in this space, right? It's very oriented around what your customers want and what you want the experience to look like. And then we just do the gap analysis. And that's like, you want that 3 years down the road, where all the things you would need to have to realize that. And how would you sequence that work in a particular way that makes sense from a business and finance and like strategic perspective?
That sounds good. And obviously something we should all aspire to have that vision and the strategy to support it. And I think, as you say, so often that feels like it's lacking because, as you say, people are just, they almost feel that reacting to individual customer requests is what being customer focused means. They're focusing on each individual customer. And you get the recency bias that comes in and just chasing your tail a little bit. So yeah, hopefully this can be really helpful in trying to explore that with some of these companies that maybe aren't there yet. But have you got any like really good examples of times where you've taken this framework in maybe to a client, or maybe even used it yourself, and you feel that it's been the difference between, say, success and failure of a particular product or product line that you're trying to help out with? Like, what's a good example of a time where this has really shone through for you?
Yeah, so there's plenty of examples in the book. We wanted to make sure it never read like a textbook. So in almost every chapter, every few pages, you'll see either a story from us or a story from one of our clients explaining the sort of concept in the real world. And all of those are now available on our site. But I probably won't call out a specific one in its entirety right now. I think the themes of things that we've seen, number one of the foundations of the framework is actually thinking about what are the right metrics of success. And the key point that we make in this part of the framework is every company has something with the dollar sign in front of it, right? And those are often lagging indicators of product success. And so the question is, how do you capture the leading indicators, which is always around what is the customer value that was created? And the way that the business captures that value just is largely a pricing and packaging problem, right? And so we often start with what are the metrics of success? And I think starting with that in the framework, I've seen it work time and time again where clients realize that because they have to define that first, that it resolves all the misalignment that happens internally of who is this for, what problem is it trying to solve, and like that, we would say that's where 90% of roadmap prioritization debates stem from, is that people are keeping score in a different way, or they just believe that we should be solving different problems for different like personas or market segments, right?
Yeah.
And so we push that up into the front of the framework, and it's always like a forcing function. And the entire framework, I would argue, is really about, it's a facilitated way of getting alignment internally. And because if you don't have some of that foundational alignment on what metrics matter and what market are we going after, it doesn't matter how great your product vision is, right? And so there's a little bit of a sequencing that we provide in the book. And the book is basically split up into three main parts. In the first part, we talk about the 10 dysfunctions and why we think the framework can help. In the second part, we present the theory of the kind of the three key concepts, right? One is picking the right outcome metrics and thinking about the customer outcome. We call it key outcomes. And we have pyramids where we break the metrics down into its constituent parts. The second part is, how do you think of a customer journey vision for how to 10x that outcome for your customers? How do you make incredible value, launch a game-changing product in the market? And then the third major step is to like kind of work backwards from that vision and create a multi-year roadmap or a strategic plan that says, these are the gaps we need to fill from where we are today to realize that vision. And then the third part of the book, we really get into more of the tactical aspects. So the first chapter there is this balanced road mapping concept, which we covered. Then it's all about the right processes and the right people to like actually implement the framework. So, it was intended to be a guide that introduced theory, but then brought it straight back to the real world and says like, this is not a textbook. Here's the templates. And then we built a bunch of digital resources that went along with the book, worksheets, templates, examples, guides to like help people who were interested in implementing any of the concepts they read about for each chapter.
Again, sounds really good. And we'll obviously link that into the show notes as well. But before we do that, you said that you're passionate about your life's legacy on the world. And obviously you're doing your part for product management. But are you involved in any other non-product management initiatives to try and make the world a better place? Are there any other passion projects you've got on at the moment?
Yeah, so I'd say the only other one I've been thinking a lot about has been charitable giving. And, my wife and I have been very fortunate, and we've thought about, what are the causes we want to support in our lives, and what are the best vehicles or channels to do that. And like, this was a great question, by the way, Jason, in your kind of in the prep form for the interview. Honestly, this stemmed from a part of the framework. And so, as we were building the framework and we've been using it for a while, we present this idea of a key outcome. And so what I did myself was, if I were going to think about what my key outcome in life is, like, how would I explain that? Because if I couldn't explain that, then how could anyone ever apply this like framework and concept in the real world? I'll be honest, the first thing I put up there was sort of like happiness. And then I broke happiness down into different things. And then I thought about it. I was like, actually, I don't think that's the key outcome for me on a personal level. I think it's about leaving a legacy and making this world a better place than when I came into it. And so then I thought about how do you break that down into different aspects, right? Obviously, I've worked in the sustainability space. And so I think about the environmental like sort of aspects of this. I've worked in the financial wellness space and I recognize the sort of like economic aspects of people's lives. I've worked in healthcare now, so I recognize the sort of like physical wellness. And so for me, when I thought about like that, it really helped me realize like, okay, there are a lot of different things I could do to move the needle on some of these things that I'm passionate about, these causes. And, for me, I've started to realize some of that might come through my work. I might go work at a company that sort of addresses this challenge or this mission with a digital product. I might also go volunteer my time in certain aspects, right? And just go support like a nonprofit here in Austin or something that's doing something there. And I might also just, we might also donate money to some of these causes. And so the context of that was actually coming out of like, okay, how do we support all the things that we care about in our lives? And, we have finite amount of time. And so that was sort of the genesis behind that idea of like leaving a legacy, and then how charitable giving ended up being an important part. And I've been fortunate to work with a couple of clients who actually did have digital products in the charitable giving space. And that kind of pushed my thinking a lot on sort of what types of products could be cool and interesting. And both of those companies have really interesting products.
Yeah, I think everyone who works in product, or most people that I've spoken to that I've asked this question, there's always this kind of goal of, yeah, maybe one day I'll work for that health tech startup that, I keep thinking about or whatever, just because it's nice to think that you're doing something for someone other than yourself. So, yeah, I guess you get to work with a bunch of different types of companies. So, as you say, hopefully you'll be able to make a big difference that way. And where can people find you after this if they want to find out more about your framework, or maybe find out about your book, or ask you any questions about anything they've heard today?
Yeah, sure. LinkedIn is probably where I'm most active, so they can just add me or follow me. I post a lot of content. Most of what I try to focus on is like applying the framework in the real world so that it can feel real and not just theoretical. And if anyone is interested in learning more about the framework, our site, Prodify.group, is a great place to go. There's a lot of resources, and we have a lot of those kind of digital worksheets, templates, artifacts available there as well.
I shall appropriately link it in, and again, hopefully we'll get a few people coming over and finding out more.
Hope so.
Well, that's been a really fantastic chat. So obviously really appreciate you spending the time and taking us through some of your thoughts and experience. Hopefully we can stay in touch. But as for now, again, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. And thank you for doing this. And I know how much time it must take, and I really appreciate what you're doing for the product community across the world. So thank you for taking the time. I really enjoyed being here today.
Thanks for listening. I hope you now spend some time focusing on your own product vision. If you like this episode, then again, please pop over to the website onenightinproduct.com and check out some of my other episodes with thought leaders and practitioners. Sign up to the mailing list or subscribe on your podcast app. Make sure you never miss another episode again. I'll be back soon with another inspiring guest, but as for now, thanks and good night.